Last week, Dean Stout preached about faith as trust. He said, when we say those words, I believe in God, in the creed, what we're really affirming isn't something abstract or impersonal. Rather, we're making a personal commitment. We're saying, I trust you. And since I heard those words, a question has been lingering in my mind this past week. And that's this. Is the life of faith something linear or something cyclical? What I mean is it the sort of thing that we make progress in? Or is it the sort of thing that we come back to again and again, where we return to where we started? Well, I think this question's been on my mind because typically trust is something that grows. We wouldn't think very much of a friendship where all we ever talked about was the weather. We expect that over time, relationships will deepen. We'll be able to trust one another with our most intimate thoughts. So shouldn't we expect the same of our relationship with God? A lot of our religious language seems to presuppose that we make progress. We use the words of journey and travel. Abraham, that great exemplar of the faith for Christians as well as for Jews and Muslims, trusts God by setting out on a journey. And often we talk about our own journeys of faith, our own pilgrimages of trust. Naturally, we expect that eventually we'll arrive at a destination. We hope that we'll get where we're headed. But sometimes that language doesn't really seem appropriate. Sometimes the journey of faith feels a lot more like a merry-go-round. Haven't we been here before? In these first few weeks of Lent, there's an uncanny sense of déjà vu. Didn't we just do this last year? And if you've made any kind of personal commitment this Lent, you may be feeling a little worn down by the sense that you've done this before, last year or the year before or 10 years ago. The same things that troubled you then may still be troubling you now. Have we really made any progress at all? Well, this tension between the life of faith as a linear journey, something we make progress in, and the life of faith as a cycle, something we return to, is present also in the book of Psalms. There are 150 of these songs, and if you trace them from the start to the end, you'll go through all the various dispositions that a soul can feel. One commentator has called them an anatomy of all the parts of the soul. And if you felt it, I can guarantee that it's in there. Joy and anger, betrayal, disappointment, and also exaltation, worship. Once you get to the end of the book of Psalms, you arrive at that destination of being purely wrapped up in God, entirely joyful in God's presence. And within the 150 Psalms, there's also a smaller arc of 15 Psalms, what are called the Psalms of Ascent. These are songs that scholars speculate were sung by pilgrims on their way to the holy city. A kind of track list, a Spotify playlist, if you will, for the journey to Jerusalem. And Psalm 121, which our choir sang for us, is the second in those psalms. You can hear a little bit of an echo of that journey in its last line when it talks about the Lord watching our going out and our coming in. That may not be a metaphor in this psalm. And yet the Psalms aren't simply a story of progress. They're not just about getting to our destination. There's a repetitive quality, a cyclical quality to them too. Our church calendar is built around that cycle. On Good Friday this year, we'll have Psalm 22, as we did last year, and the year before that, and, oh yes, going back about 2 millennia. And on Easter, we'll have Psalm 118, the same rhythm of songs again and again. Our calendar, of course, is structured largely on the Jewish people's calendar. And that was arranged around High Holy Days, when people would make their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And as scholars speculate, they may have been singing these psalms of ascent as they went. Each one is short enough that you can memorize it and sing it, even for those whose memory isn't that great. But Psalm 121, our psalm this morning, is a little bit unusual. It's got a call and response character to it. Perhaps you heard it as the choir sang, that antiphonal beginning. I lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help? And then immediately that answer is given. My help cometh from the Lord, even the maker of heaven and earth. It's almost like a catechism, question and response. And it's hard not to think that perhaps it's built that way simply so that answer gets ingrained in our mind. Our choir sang the response as a refrain throughout the psalm. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And so one of the things that seems to be happening in this psalm is that we are returned again and again to almost a mantra. God is our help. That is where our help comes from. We don't know anything about the psalmist's situation. It's intriguingly general. I lift up my eyes to the hills. And yet it's almost more relatable for being that open. We too can say with the psalmist, my help comes from the Lord. Well, rote memorization, the repetition that educators relied on for a very long time, isn't much in fashion right now. And there are probably good reasons that we don't have blackboards and force students to say the same things over and over again. But I think it's also true that many of us aren't able to say poetry by heart in the way that our parents or grandparents were able to. Although it's sometimes true that repetition is mindless, that sense of saying something by heart, that lovely phrase, there's a way that words can get beneath our skin, that we can inhabit them more fully if we know them. A good Lenten discipline might be simply to memorize a psalm or two, to take it to heart. And repetition really does seem to be at the heart of this psalm. The word watch, or perhaps more accurately, guard, comes up 5 times in 8 verses. The psalmist imagines all the ways that God's attention is trained on us. As one person glossed it to me this past week, it's as if God is a wakeful mother watching her baby sleep. There's no chance that she'll fall asleep. She's focused. Or the scene shifts and sun and moon are alternating, night and day, each having their own dangers, and yet God is standing guard. And again, another metaphor, perhaps this one not metaphorical. We are on a journey and we go out and we come in, and yet all the same, God's attention is trained on us. Well, you may think this is rather repetitious, and you wouldn't be the first person to think so. John Calvin, in his commentary on this psalm, says, well, it's really making the same point over and over again. It gets a bit tedious. What's the idea? And he says, yes, it is repetitive, but that's on purpose. It stresses that point that God watches us simply because we're so slow to believe that. It takes a long time to trust God. And so John Calvin says that's why the Bible's so long. It's just making that same point over and over again. God's attention is on us. God is watching over us. Well, you can read that message in the 121st Psalm, or you can read it in John's Gospel. God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. And surely one of the things that makes the Psalms so special, so precious, such a rich heritage to inhabit, is that these are the words that Jesus himself prayed. They were his prayer book, as they're still the church's prayer book. And you can hear the way that these psalms worked their way into Jesus' memory. It's the book of the Bible that he quotes the most often. He relies on it throughout his life and in his teaching, and even on the cross, he's there quoting the psalm. And so one of the things that we do when we repeat the Psalms is we repeat after Jesus. We say what he said. And his life shows what a life of trust to God really looks like. It makes me think of the way that children learn to speak. It's often by repeating after their parents or their siblings. And so there's a sense in which, as we say the Psalms, we're repeating after our sibling, Jesus, so that we too might trust in the one he called Father. Well, you should have guessed by now that if a preacher starts with a dichotomy at the beginning of a sermon, the resolution is not going to be either of the alternatives by the end of the sermon. Guilty as charged. I don't think that the life of faith is either simply linear progress, always up and up, nor do I think that trust is simply something circling round and round and round again. No. Trust is something that we grow in simply by doing the same things again and again. I think of the way that children learn to trust parents. It's by doing the same things, by having that consistency, the rhythms of eating together, speaking together, asking for forgiveness and receiving forgiveness together. And I think that's part of the wisdom of our worship. You may have noticed that what happens here doesn't vary all that much week to week. We make our thanksgiving at the Eucharist. We confess our sins. And part of the wisdom of that rhythm, that sameness, is simply that we learn to trust God by doing these things over and over again. So that when the merry-go-round of the church year spins once more, there are grooves on our hearts, and we can follow along. But perhaps the more important rhythm is simply the rhythm that each of us makes. The rhythm of messing up, of not treating others the way we know we should, of failing in our personal lives and in public, and simply learning to ask for forgiveness. One of the interesting things you'll notice if you read the lives of great saints is how often they feel that they're very far from the ideal. It seems the further on in the journey you get, the more you realize how much further there is to go. And I think that sense of sin, that sense of distance, is certainly something to pay attention to. It's the places God's calling us to grow. The Desert Fathers spoke about the life of faith as simply falling down and getting back up. You fall down and you get back up. That, after all, is the way that children learn to walk. They fall down, they get back up. But they learn to do that because they know that their parent is watching over them, attentive, ready to help them when they want to stand up. So when we fall down, let us stand up. Amen.